In a room built on legacy and appearances, silence broke the moment Jackson Reed stepped forward and spat directly into his wife's face. No one moved. Not his mother, not the relatives, not the business associates who had just seconds ago been smiling over champagne. Kristin Foster didn't flinch. She didn't wipe it away. She only stood there still as if the humiliation belonged to someone else. What no one in that room understood, what no one had been told, was that just hours earlier, every ounce of power they respected had quietly shifted into her hands. They thought they were witnessing her downfall. They weren't. They were watching his. If you believe dignity doesn't need to be loud to be powerful, stay with this story until the end. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if stories about quiet strength and rightful justice speak to you, consider subscribing. The house sat behind iron gates that had been polished so often they reflected the late afternoon light like glass. In this part of Connecticut, homes were not just places to live. They were statements. Legacies preserved in stone, timber, and silence. The Reed estate was no exception. It had been in Margaret Reed's family for decades, passed down with the same careful pride as their last name. Inside, everything felt arranged rather than lived in. Crystal vases stood untouched. Portraits of past generations watched from the walls with a quiet authority that no one dared to challenge. Even the air carried a kind of expectation, as if every word spoken inside had to earn its place. Kristin Foster moved through that space without disturbing it. She wore a simple ivory dress, tailored but unassuming. No jewelry beyond a thin watch on her wrist. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing a face that did not seek attention and yet could not be overlooked. There was something in her stillness that made people uncertain. Not fragile, not submissive, just unreadable. In her hand, her phone vibrated once. She didn't check it immediately. At the far end of the room, Jackson Reed stood near the bar, laughing too loudly at something that wasn't particularly funny. His posture had changed over the past year. It was subtle but noticeable to anyone who paid attention. His shoulders carried a weight that wasn't responsibility, it was expectation. The kind that came from believing something bigger was about to be handed to him. He glanced across the room, his eyes landing on Kristin Foster. For a moment, his smile tightened, not because she had done anything, but because she hadn't. Kristin had a way of not reacting that unsettled him. She didn't argue, didn't correct, didn't defend herself when his mother made cutting remarks dressed as concern. She simply observed. And in a house where everyone performed constantly, her refusal to participate felt like a quiet kind of defiance. "Kristin," a voice called from behind. Margaret Reed approached with practiced elegance, her heels barely making a sound against the marble floor. She carried herself like someone who believed she had built everything around her, even though most of it had been inherited. "You're here," Margaret said, her tone polite but thin. Kristin turned slightly. "I am." Margaret's eyes moved over her, taking in the dress, the absence of jewelry, the simplicity. "You might have told me what you planned to wear," she said. "This is a formal evening." Kristin didn't look down at herself. "I thought this was appropriate." Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Appropriate is a flexible word. There was a pause, not awkward, just deliberate. Around them, a few relatives pretended not to listen. They had heard variations of this exchange before. It was part of the rhythm of the house. Margaret would comment. Kristin would respond just enough. And nothing would change. What matters, Margaret continued, lowering her voice slightly, is presentation. Especially tonight. There are people here who expect a certain standard. Kristin nodded once. "I understand." But she didn't adjust anything, didn't apologize, didn't offer to change. Margaret studied her for a second longer, as if trying to decide whether the response was ignorance or something else. Then she turned away, already moving on to greet someone more responsive. Kristin exhaled softly, not in frustration, just acknowledgement. Her phone vibrated again. This time, she looked. A single message filled the screen. Daniel Brooks. The transfer is complete. All confirmations received. You now hold full controlling interest. We proceed when you say so. Kristin's thumb hovered over the screen. There were attachments beneath the message. Legal confirmations, bank acknowledgments, digital signatures that carried more weight than anything spoken in the room around her. For a moment, the noise of the gathering faded. Not completely. Just enough. She thought of Edward Foster. Her father had never raised his voice. Not once in her memory. He didn't believe in loud authority. He believed in structure, in preparation, in ensuring that when something mattered, it could not be taken away by force or persuasion. You don't protect something when it's under attack, he had told her once years ago in an office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. You protect it long before anyone realizes it needs protection. At the time, she hadn't fully understood. Now she did. Kristin locked her phone. She didn't reply. Across the room, Jackson had begun speaking again, this time drawing a small group closer. His voice carried easily confident, assured. It's about direction, he was saying. The company's been stable, sure. But stability isn't growth. At some point, someone has to step in and make decisions. There were nods, encouraging ones. And you think that someone is you a man? Asked lightly, a half-smile on his face. Jackson didn't hesitate. I think I understand what needs to be done. It was said casually, but the implication was clear. Kristin watched without moving. She noticed who leaned in closer, who laughed a little too quickly, who stayed silent but didn't disagree. Information she had learned rarely came from what people declared. It came from what they revealed without realizing. Near the edge of the group stood Alan Pierce, the interim CFO. His expression was neutral, but his attention was sharp. He didn't laugh, didn't interrupt, just listened. Kristin had seen his name too many times in recent weeks. In forwarded emails that weren't meant for her. In financial summaries that didn't quite align. In small discrepancies that, taken alone, meant nothing but together suggested something deliberate. She looked away before he could notice. A server passed by with a tray of champagne glasses. Kristin took one more out of habit than intention. The glass was cold against her fingers. Everything about the evening was controlled. The lighting, the music, the conversations. It was designed to feel effortless. It wasn't. Every interaction had weight. Every word was measured. Even the silences meant something. Jackson's voice rose slightly again, drawing attention. We've all seen what happens when leadership hesitates, he said. When decisions get delayed because someone isn't ready to make them. There was a subtle shift in the room. Not obvious, but present. It was no longer just conversation. It was positioning. Kristin met his gaze briefly. He held it for a second longer than necessary. A challenge, perhaps, or a test. She didn't respond, didn't look away immediately either. Just enough to acknowledge, not enough to engage. That unsettled him more than anything she could have said. He broke eye contact first. Margaret reappeared at his side, placing a hand lightly on his arm. A gesture that looked affectionate but carried direction. Jackson, she said softly, will be starting shortly. He nodded, his expression resetting into something more composed. As the room began to shift, people moving toward the main hall, conversations tapering into anticipation, Kristin remained where she was for a moment longer. She set her untouched glass down on a nearby table. Her phone rested quietly in her hand. Everything that mattered had already been decided. Just not here, not yet. When she finally moved, it was without hesitation. Not toward Jackson, not toward Margaret, but toward the center of the room where in a matter of minutes everything would begin to unravel. There had been a time when Jackson Reed knew how to wait. In the early years of their marriage, he had been patient in a way that felt almost deliberate. He listened more than he spoke. He studied the rhythms of Kristin Foster's family, the way decisions were made without being announced, the way influence moved quietly through rooms instead of being declared at the center of them. Back then, he understood that power in the Foster world was not something you reached for. It was something you were allowed to step into. That understanding didn't last. It didn't disappear all at once. It shifted slowly, almost invisibly at first. A comment here, an assumption there, a sense that proximity meant entitlement, that being married into something meant becoming part of it in a way that required no permission. Kristin had watched that shift happen in real time, not with suspicion, with clarity. The first sign had been small, a forwarded email. It had come late at night when Jackson assumed she was asleep. The subject line had been routine internal projections, quarterly adjustments, but the body of the message had included a line that didn't belong. We'll move it after the board review. No need to involve Kristin yet. It wasn't the content that caught her attention. It was the certainty, the assumption that she was not part of the process, that she didn't need to be. She hadn't confronted him. She hadn't asked who he referred to. Instead, she saved the email, filed it into a folder that already contained things she hadn't been meant to see. Over the following weeks, those things multiplied. There were expense reports that didn't match the numbers she remembered from past briefings with her father. Transfers that passed through intermediary accounts before settling into places that had no clear connection to company operations. Names appeared repeatedly. One of them was Alan Pierce, interim CFO, temporary in title, permanent in influence, at least in Jackson's eyes. Kristin had met Alan several times over the years. He had always been careful, measured, the kind of man who never said more than necessary but always seemed to be listening for more than what was offered. He never treated her with open disrespect. He simply didn't treat her as relevant. That more than anything had told her what she needed to know. Relevance in their world was never accidental. It was assigned or denied. Jackson began to speak differently around her, not louder, not harsher, just less filtered. He no longer explained things. He declared them. We're restructuring the portfolio next quarter, he said one evening, loosening his tie as he moved through the kitchen. Kristin stood at the counter, slicing something she didn't intend to eat. She asked, not looking up. He didn't hesitate. Alan and I. It's already in motion. There was no invitation in his tone. No pause for her response. Kristin nodded once. I see. And that was the end of the conversation. Not because she didn't have more to say, because she didn't need to say it. That became the pattern. Jackson expanded, Kristin observed. He began attending meetings he hadn't been invited to before, introducing himself in conversations that used to move around him, referring to the company as if it had already adjusted to include him at its center. No one corrected him directly. Not yet. But there were signs, subtle ones, conversations that shifted when he approached, emails that excluded him from final decisions, polite acknowledgments that stopped just short of agreement. He noticed those things, but he interpreted them differently, not as resistance, as delay. And delay in his mind was temporary. What he didn't see, what he never thought to look for, was the difference between being tolerated and being trusted. Kristin saw it clearly. She also saw something else, the pattern in the numbers. It didn't emerge all at once. It formed over time, like a shape coming into focus from a distance. Transfers that aligned too neatly, adjustments that benefited the same accounts. timing that suggested intention rather than coincidence. She didn't jump to conclusions. She documented every email, every report, every inconsistency. She built a timeline that didn't rely on interpretation, only on sequence, dates, amounts, names. And in the center of that pattern, again and again, were Jackson and Alan. There was a moment, just one, when she considered asking him directly. It came late one night. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that made every small sound feel amplified. Jackson sat in his office, the door slightly open, the glow of his laptop screen casting a narrow line of light into the hallway. Kristin paused outside. She could hear his voice, low, controlled. We'll handle it after the transition, he was saying. There's no reason to complicate things now. A pause, then softer but clearer. She won't be involved. Kristin didn't move. She didn't need to see who was on the other end of the call. She already knew. She stepped away before he finished speaking, back into the darkness of the hallway, back into the part of the house that remained untouched by his certainty. The next morning, she scheduled a meeting. Not with Jackson, with Daniel Brooks, her father's attorney. The man who had been present at every major decision Edward Foster had ever made, but had never once spoken out of turn. His office was exactly as she remembered. Minimal, orderly. Nothing displayed that didn't serve a purpose. He didn't greet her with surprise when she walked in. He stood, nodded once, and gestured for her to sit. "I was expecting you," he said. Kristin didn't ask how. She placed a folder on the desk between them. Inside it were copies, not originals. She never kept originals in one place. Emails, transaction summaries, notes. Daniel opened the folder without comment. He read in silence. Minutes passed. Kristin didn't interrupt. She had learned that silence, when held correctly, revealed more than questions ever could. When he finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed. But something in his posture had. A recognition. "This began earlier than I expected," he said. Kristin met his gaze. "You knew it would happen." Daniel closed the folder. "Your father didn't believe in hope as a strategy," he said. "He believed in preparation." He reached for a document on his desk. Not one of hers, one of his. "This," he said, sliding it toward her, "is why." Kristin looked down. The language was precise, legal, structured in a way that left little room for interpretation. Control clauses, transfer conditions, voting rights tied to a timeline that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with inevitability. He didn't trust the board to resist pressure, Daniel continued. And he certainly didn't trust anyone who thought proximity equaled ownership. He didn't say Jackson's name. He didn't need to. Kristin turned a page, then another. Everything was there. Not just the transfer of assets, the transfer of authority. Quiet, absolute, irreversible once activated. She felt something shift. Not emotionally, structurally. Like a framework she had been standing inside without fully seeing, it had just become visible. "When does it take effect?" she asked. Daniel held her gaze. "It already has." The room didn't change. Nothing outside reacted. There was no announcement, no signal. Just a fact that existed, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Kristin closed the document. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel added, almost as an afterthought, "There are additional protections. Audit flags your father authorized. Records that were meant to surface if certain patterns appeared." Kristin didn't ask what patterns. She already knew. Daniel tapped the folder she had brought. "You were meant to find this," he said. "Not as praise, as confirmation." Kristin stood. Not abruptly, not slowly. Just with intention. "Then we proceed," she said. Daniel nodded once. "When you're ready." She picked up her folder. left the document he had given her on the desk. She didn't need to take it. It was already in effect. As she stepped back into the world outside the office, nothing looked different. The streets moved the same. The buildings stood unchanged. People passed without noticing anything had shifted. But something had. Not visibly. Not yet. And when she returned to the Reed house that evening, she moved through it the same way she always had. Quiet, unobtrusive, unchallenging. Because the most important changes she had learned never announced themselves when they happened. They revealed themselves when it was too late to stop them. Edward Foster had never believed in inheritance as a gesture. To him, it was not a reward nor a tradition to be honored out of sentiment. It was a mechanism, a structure that either preserved what had been built or exposed it to the kind of erosion that came from impatience, entitlement, and unchecked access. That was why he had never spoken openly about succession. Not at home, not in boardrooms, not even to Kristin Foster in ways that could be repeated or misunderstood. Instead, he had constructed something far more precise, something that would not depend on loyalty or appearances or marriage. Daniel Brooks had only shown her part of it. The rest came later. Not in a single meeting, but through a series of controlled disclosures that unfolded over days, each one adding another layer to what her father had designed. The trust structure was the foundation. It appeared straightforward at first glance, a standard allocation of assets, voting shares, and operational oversight tied to the Foster Group, but embedded within it were conditions that altered everything. Voting control was not distributed. It was concentrated. And not in the board, not in executive leadership, but in a single entity that remained dormant until triggered by a specific event. Edward's death had not been that trigger. Time had. A clause buried deep within the legal language tied activation to a date rather than a declaration, a point at which temporary arrangements expired and permanent authority took hold automatically without requiring approval from anyone who might attempt to delay it. That date had passed. Quietly, without ceremony, without announcement. Kristin now held full controlling interest, not symbolically, not partially, completely. The board could convene, they could advise, they could question, but they could not override. That was the first layer. The second was protection. Edward had authorized a series of internal audit flags years before his death. They were not active monitoring systems in the traditional sense. They were dormant protocols, silent until triggered by specific patterns in financial behavior. Unusual transfers, repeated routing through intermediary accounts, timing inconsistencies tied to reporting cycles. When those patterns appeared, the system didn't alert management. It documented, it preserved, it built a record that could not be erased retroactively. Alan Pierce had no way of knowing that those safeguards existed. Neither did Jackson Reed. To them, the system behaved as expected. Numbers moved, reports updated, approvals were logged. But beneath that surface, something else had been recording every deviation from standard practice. Not interfering, not correcting, just waiting. Daniel had shown her the compiled data in stages, not overwhelming her with volume, but guiding her through it with precision. This is not about proving intent, he had said during their second meeting, sliding a set of printed records across the desk. Intent is difficult to establish without interpretation. This is about establishing pattern. Pattern doesn't require opinion. Kristin had studied the documents in silence. Columns of numbers, dates aligned too neatly, transactions that seemed routine until placed side by side. When viewed individually, each could be explained. When viewed together, they formed something else entirely. A structure, a system operating within the system. And at the center of it, again and again, were the same two names, Jackson and Allen. There were no direct transfers into personal accounts, nothing so careless. Instead, funds moved through layered entities, consulting fees, short-term allocations, reimbursements tied to vague operational needs. Each step justified, each layer obscuring the one beneath it. But the pattern remained. Daniel had tapped one page lightly. "Your father anticipated this," he said, "not the specifics, but the method." Kristin looked up. He expected someone to try to move within the structure. Daniel continued, to test its limits, to see what could be taken without triggering attention. "And this doesn't trigger attention?" Kristin asked. Daniel's expression didn't change. "It doesn't trigger intervention," he corrected. "There's a difference." That distinction mattered. Intervention could be resisted, delayed, manipulated. Documentation could not. It simply existed, and when the time came, it could be presented without interpretation, without argument, without room for denial. The third layer was something Kristin had not expected. Audio, not surveillance, not in the way most people would assume. Edward had not believed in recording conversations secretly within his own company. That created liability, risk. But he had believed in preserving moments that revealed character. There was one file in particular. Daniel had hesitated before playing it. "Your father left this with specific instructions," he said. "It's not evidence in the legal sense, but it provides context." Kristin had nodded. He pressed play. The recording was brief. A meeting years ago. Voices slightly distorted by distance. Edward's voice was calm, measured. Another voice, recognizable though younger, carried a different tone. Confident, slightly impatient. "Jackson. I just think there's an opportunity here," Jackson was saying. If decisions were made more efficiently, if there was less hesitation, Edward didn't interrupt. He let him finish, then quietly he asked, "And who do you believe should be making those decisions?" A pause. Then, without hesitation, "Someone who understands where the company needs to go." There was no direct claim, no explicit statement, but the implication was clear. Edward didn't challenge him, didn't correct him. He simply said, "Understanding direction and respecting structure are not the same thing." The recording ended there. Daniel turned off the device. He never confronted him directly, Daniel said. He preferred to see how people revealed themselves when they believed they were being considered. Kristin absorbed that. Not as a judgment, as confirmation. Jackson hadn't changed. He had simply become more comfortable expressing what had always been there. The final layer was timing. Everything Edward had built depended on sequence. Not just what happened, but when. If control had transferred too early, it would have been contested. If it had transferred too late, damage could have been done that no structure could fully repair. Instead, he had created a window. A period during which those who believed themselves to be rising would act with increasing confidence, without realizing that the foundation beneath them was about to shift. Kristin stood at the center of that window now. Not by accident, by design. And yet, despite everything she had seen, everything she now held, she did not move immediately. She returned to the Reed house, walked through its carefully arranged rooms, listened to the conversations that continued as if nothing had changed. Jackson spoke about future strategies. Margaret discussed appearances. Relatives speculated quietly about what would happen next. No one mentioned Edward, not in a way that acknowledged what he had built. Kristin didn't correct them, didn't reveal anything. Because revelation, she understood, was not about timing alone. It was about alignment, evidence, authority, and the moment when denial was no longer possible. That moment had not yet arrived. But it was approaching. She could feel it in the way Jackson's confidence had sharpened into something more aggressive. In the way Alan's communications had become more frequent, more direct. In the subtle acceleration of decisions that should have required more caution, they believed they were moving forward. They didn't realize they were moving into something already prepared for them. Late that evening, Kristin sat alone in the study. The same room where Jackson often worked. The same desk, the same view. Her phone rested in front of her. Unread messages, unsent responses. A network of people waiting for direction she had not yet given. She opened one message. Daniel Brooks. We are ready when you are. Kristin looked at it for a long moment. Then she locked the screen. Not yet. Because control, she had learned, was not proven by how quickly it was exercised. It was proven by knowing exactly when not to. The hours leading up to the gathering carried a kind of tension that did not announce itself openly, but settled into the spaces between conversations. At the Reed estate, preparation was not chaotic. It was controlled. Staff moved quietly through the halls, adjusting lighting, aligning place settings, ensuring that every visible detail reflected the family's sense of permanence. Outside, the driveway had already begun to fill with cars that did not need introductions. Inside, Margaret Reed stood near the entrance, overseeing the final arrangements with a calm authority that left little room for error. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Make sure the seating reflects the updated list, she instructed one of the staff members. There have been changes. The staff member nodded quickly and moved away. Margaret's gaze shifted, scanning the room, assessing not just what was present, but what might be out of place. Her eyes landed on Kristin Foster. Kristin stood near one of the tall windows, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. She had arrived earlier than most, not out of obligation, but because she preferred to see a room before it filled with voices. Margaret approached. "You're early," she said. Kristin turned slightly. "I prefer it that way." Margaret's eyes moved to the folder Kristin held loosely at her side. Still carrying those things around, she asked, her tone light but edged. "You won't need paperwork tonight. This isn't one of your father's meetings." Kristin didn't look down at the folder. "I know." "Then you can leave it somewhere," Margaret continued. "It doesn't fit the tone." There was a brief pause. Kristin nodded once. "I'll take care of it." But she didn't set it down. Margaret watched her for a moment longer, then exhaled softly, more a sign of dismissal than frustration, and turned away to greet the next arrival. Kristin remained where she was. The folder in her hand wasn't thick. Didn't need to be. Inside were printed copies of things she had already committed to memory. Email chains, transaction summaries, names that appeared too often to be coincidence. Among them, repeatedly, were Jackson Reed and Alan Pierce. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Across the room, Jackson entered through the main hallway, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as he moved. He looked composed, intentional, the version of himself he preferred others to see. When he noticed Kristin, his expression shifted slightly, not into warmth, but into something more controlled. "You're here already," he said as he approached. "I am." He glanced at the folder. Still working, just reviewing. He gave a short nod, though it was clear he wasn't interested in the answer. "We have people coming tonight who matter," he said. "It would be good if we presented consistently." Kristin met his gaze. Consistently. With each other, he clarified. No unnecessary tension, no misunderstandings. The words were carefully chosen. They always were. Kristin considered them for a moment. "There's no misunderstanding," she said. Jackson held her gaze, searching for something, agreement perhaps, or submission. He didn't find either. Instead, he found stillness. And that unsettled him more than resistance ever had. "Good," he said finally. "Then we won't have any issues." He turned before she could respond, already moving toward another conversation, another audience. Kristin watched him go, not with emotion, with attention. The house began to fill, voices layered over one another. Laughter that sounded practiced rather than spontaneous. Conversations that started with pleasantries and quickly shifted into quiet assessments. Relatives from both sides of the family moved through the rooms, greeting one another with familiarity that did not always translate into warmth. Near the dining area, two of Jackson's cousins spoke in low voices. "He's been more involved lately," one of them said, glancing toward Jackson. "I heard he's already sitting in on strategic meetings." The other nodded. "It makes sense. Someone has to step in eventually." And her the first asked, subtly indicating Kristin. A brief pause. "She's different," the second replied. "I don't think she's interested in that kind of responsibility." Kristin heard them, not because they were loud, because she was listening. She didn't turn toward them, didn't acknowledge the conversation. But she noted it, not the words themselves, the assumptions behind them. Across the room, Alan Pierce had arrived. He stood near the edge of a group, speaking quietly with one of the board's external advisors. His posture was composed, his tone measured. When his eyes moved across the room and briefly met Kristin's, there was no reaction. No recognition, no acknowledgement, just a passing glance. That too told her what she needed to know. Relevance again, assigned or denied. A server approached with a tray of drinks. Kristin declined with a slight shake of her head. Her attention shifted back to the room, to the movement of people, to the patterns in their interactions. She saw who gravitated toward Jackson, who deferred to Margaret, who positioned themselves near Alan without appearing to do so. Information wasn't always in documents. Sometimes it was in proximity, in alignment, in silence. Her phone vibrated softly. She didn't check it immediately. When she did, it was with the same calm precision she applied to everything else. Daniel Brooks. "We've identified additional transfers. Same structure, same accounts. Time-stamped within the last 48 hours. Kristin read the message once. Then again. The timing mattered. It always did. If the pattern had continued even now, this close to the transition, it meant something important. Confidence, not caution. They believed they were still operating within a system that would not challenge them. She typed a response, then paused. Deleted it, locked the screen. Not yet. Across the room, Jackson's voice rose slightly as he addressed a small group. "It's about understanding momentum," he was saying. "You can't hesitate when there's an opportunity to move forward. That's how companies fall behind." There were nods, agreement, encouragement. Kristin watched as Robert Whitman, the chairman of the board, entered quietly through a side door. He didn't announce himself. He rarely did. His presence shifted the room in a way that wasn't immediately visible but gradually felt. People adjusted. Postures straightened. Conversations softened. He exchanged a brief word with Margaret, then turned his gaze moving across the room until it settled briefly on Kristin. There was a pause. Not long, but deliberate, a recognition that did not need to be explained. Then he nodded, once, and moved on. Kristin didn't react, but she noticed everything. The gathering was almost at full capacity now. The air had changed. Not heavier, more focused. Like a stage just before the performance begins, Jackson stepped toward the center of the room, drawing attention without explicitly asking for it. Margaret moved closer to him, her presence reinforcing his. Alan remained where he was observing, and Kristin stood at the edge. Still, unobtrusive. Holding a folder no one believed mattered. Carrying information no one knew existed. And waiting. Not for the right words, not for the right moment to respond, but for the point at which everything that had been set in motion would align. It hadn't yet, but it was close. Close enough that the room itself seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. Close enough that every assumption being made around her was about to become something else entirely. And when that shift came, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic. It would simply be undeniable. The transition from conversation to attention happened without announcement. No one called for silence. No glass was raised. And yet, as if guided by an unspoken agreement, the room gradually shifted toward the center where Jackson Reed now stood. He didn't take a stage. He didn't need one. Position in that room was less about elevation and more about expectation. And Jackson had learned quickly how to place himself where expectation gathered. "Thank you all for coming." He began, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the edges without seeming forced. People turned, some out of courtesy, some out of interest, and a few out of calculation. Behind him, Margaret Reed stood slightly to the side, her presence both supportive and directive. She didn't speak, but her posture suggested alignment, approval, continuity. Jackson continued. "It means a great deal to have everyone here, especially at a time when the Foster legacy is transitioning." The word lingered. Transitioning. Carefully chosen. Ambiguous enough to invite interpretation. Clear enough to suggest movement. Across the room, Kristin Foster remained near the edge of the gathering. Not hidden, not highlighted, simply present. She watched. Not just Jackson, the room. Who leaned forward, who exchanged glances, who nodded before the sentence had fully formed. Information moved faster in anticipation than in reaction. Jackson shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance as if settling into something that already belonged to him. "There are moments," he said, "when stability is no longer enough. When maintaining what exists becomes less important than guiding what comes next." A few quiet murmurs of agreement followed. Not loud, but deliberate, encouraging. He let the silence sit for a beat before continuing. "And I believe we're at one of those moments now." There it was. Not a declaration, not explicitly, but close enough. Near the back, Alan Pierce watched without expression. His hands rested loosely at his sides, his attention fixed not on Jackson's words, but on their effect. Kristin noticed. Of course she did. Alan wasn't listening for meaning. He was measuring response. That told her more than anything Jackson had said. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand. Once. She didn't look down. Not yet. Jackson continued his tone, gaining a subtle edge of confidence. "I've had the opportunity over the past months to observe, to learn, and to understand the structure of the company in ways that I think position me." He paused just long enough to suggest humility, to contribute more directly. There were smiles, encouraging ones, the kind that came from people who preferred alignment over uncertainty. From where she stood, Kristin could see Robert Whitman near the side of the room. His posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. He did not nod. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. That in itself was a response. Jackson continued speaking. Words like direction, efficiency, momentum threaded through his sentences, each one chosen to signal competence, control, readiness. He did not mention Kristin directly. He didn't need to. The absence was its own statement. Kristin felt her phone vibrate again. Twice this time. She glanced down. A new message. Daniel Brooks Board acknowledgement received. Legal standing confirmed across all entities. We are clear to proceed on your signal. Below it another. Additional flag triggered. Same routing pattern. Timestamp 2:14 p.m. Kristin read both messages without change in expression. The second mattered more than the first. It meant the pattern hadn't stopped. Even now, even tonight. That told her something precise. Jackson and Alan were not acting cautiously. They were accelerating. An acceleration without awareness of consequence always carried a cost. She locked her phone, looked up. Jackson's voice had shifted again, this time lower, more controlled. "It's not about replacing what was built," he said. "It's about ensuring that it continues stronger, more focused, and better aligned with the realities we face now." A man near the front spoke up. "And you think you're ready for that?" The question was framed lightly, but it carried weight. Jackson smiled. "Not broadly, just enough. I think I've been ready for some time." There it was. Closer now to declaration. Across the room, a few people exchanged looks. Not disagreement, not agreement, assessment. Kristin moved then, not toward him, not away, just a step forward, enough to shift her position within the room, enough to be seen without asking to be. Margaret noticed immediately. Her gaze sharpened, tracking Kristin's movement with quiet precision. Jackson didn't. Not at first. He was focused on the group in front of him, on the responses he was receiving, on the momentum he believed he had created. Kristin's phone remained still in her hand. No new messages, no new signals. Everything she needed had already arrived. The room felt different now, not visibly, but in the way attention settled, in the way conversations at the edges had quieted completely, in the way even those who had been most comfortable earlier now seemed to be waiting for something they couldn't quite name. Jackson exhaled softly, as if concluding a thought. "And I believe he said that with the right leadership in place, we can move forward without hesitation." Margaret stepped slightly closer to him. A subtle alignment, a reinforcement. From the side, Robert Whitman shifted his stance, not toward Jackson, but slightly inward, closer to the center, closer to where the room was now focused. Kristin saw it, not as a signal, as confirmation. Everything was aligning, not because of what was being said, but because of what had already been set in motion. Jackson turned then, not fully, just enough to include more of the room in his view. His eyes moved across the faces, paused, and finally landed on Kristin. There was a brief flicker of something in his expression, recognition, expectation, perhaps even a hint of challenge, as if he were waiting for her to respond, to support, to validate what he had just implied. Kristin met his gaze, calm, unchanged. She didn't nod, didn't speak, didn't move. And in that stillness, something shifted, not in her, in him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there, the first trace of uncertainty. Not because she had opposed him, but because she hadn't, because she had given him nothing to work against, nothing to define himself in contrast to, just silence, just presence, just control. He broke eye contact first, turned back to the group, continued speaking. But the rhythm had changed. Slightly, enough. Kristin didn't move again, didn't check her phone, didn't look toward Daniel, didn't acknowledge Alan, because none of that was necessary. The structure was already in place, the evidence already recorded, the authority already transferred. All that remained was timing. And timing, she knew, was not about acting quickly. It was about acting when every piece could no longer be denied. That moment had not yet arrived. But it was no longer distant. It was here, in the room, in the way people were now watching more carefully, listening more closely, waiting, even if they didn't know what they were waiting for. And when it came, it would not ask for attention. It would take it. The room did not expect a fracture, not in a house like this, not during an evening so carefully arranged to preserve continuity. Even tension, when it appeared here, was meant to stay contained, softened by etiquette, redirected by politeness, absorbed into the quiet machinery of appearances. But fractures rarely asked for permission. They happened in moments where control slipped just enough to reveal what had always been beneath it. Jackson Reed felt it before anyone else did, not as awareness, as irritation. It began with something small, a hesitation in response, a delay in agreement, the subtle absence of reinforcement he had come to expect whenever he spoke. It unsettled him, not consciously, but enough. He continued speaking, adjusting his tone, sharpening his words just slightly as he tried to regain the rhythm he had lost. "And that's why we can't afford to wait," he said, his voice carrying a firmer edge now. "Decisions delayed or opportunities lost." There were still nods, still agreement. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't automatic. Across from him, Kristin Foster stood in the same place she had been moments before. Still, composed, watching. She hadn't interrupted, hadn't contradicted, hadn't offered support. And that more than anything created space. Space that Jackson did not know how to manage. He turned toward her fully now. Not subtly, not casually, deliberately. "Kristin," he said, his voice shifting to include her in a way that was both invitation and pressure. The room followed his gaze. Attention moved, settled. Kristin met his eyes. Calm, unmoved. "You've been quiet," Jackson continued, "which isn't unusual. But tonight, I think it would be helpful for everyone to hear your perspective." The words were framed politely, but the intention was not. It was a test, or perhaps a trap. A way to draw her into a position where silence would no longer protect her, where she would have to respond, define herself, confirm what he had already begun to imply. The room waited. Kristin did not answer immediately. She didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the shift in attention. She simply stood there as she had before. And then, "I don't think my perspective would change anything you've already decided," she said. Her voice was soft, measured, but it carried. Not because it was loud, because it was clear. A slight pause followed. Jackson smiled. Tight, controlled. "That depends," he said, "on whether your perspective aligns with reality." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The tone had changed, not dramatically, but enough. Kristin tilted her head slightly. "As you define it," she asked. It wasn't a challenge. Not openly. But it wasn't agreement either. Jackson's expression hardened. "Just slightly. You've always preferred to stay separate from these discussions," he said. "Which is fine. But at some point, that distance becomes a limitation." There it was. Not an accusation, but close. Kristin didn't respond. Not immediately. She let the words settle, let the room absorb them. And in that silence, Jackson felt something else rise. Not doubt, not yet, but pressure. The need to push further, to force a conclusion. "You can't remain on the outside forever," he continued, his voice tightening, "especially when what's at stake affects all of us." All of us. The phrase hung there, inclusive, but selective. Kristin's gaze didn't shift. "If something affects all of us," she said then, "it should be handled with care." The simplicity of the statement landed harder than anything more elaborate could have. Jackson exhaled, a short, sharp breath. "And you think it isn't?" he asked. Kristin didn't answer the question directly. "I think assumptions can be mistaken for certainty," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. The room was no longer simply observing. It was listening. Carefully. Jackson stepped closer. Not aggressively, but with intent. "You're implying something," he said. "If you have a concern, you should say it." There it was again. The push. The need to bring everything into the open, on his terms. Kristin looked at him. Really looked. Not at the version he presented. At the pattern she'd been watching for months. The confidence built on proximity. The certainty built on assumption. The impatience that surfaced when neither was confirmed. "I don't think this is the right setting," she said. The response was calm, reasonable, deflective. And for a moment, it could have ended there. It should have. But Jackson didn't step back, didn't allow the moment to close, because something inside him had already crossed a line. Not visibly, but irreversibly. "Of course you don't," he said, the edge in his voice no longer fully contained. "You've never been comfortable when things become direct." A few heads turned, not toward Kristin, toward him. The shift was subtle, but present. Kristin didn't react. Jackson continued. "You prefer to observe," he said, "to stand back and take notes while everyone else actually does something." The words landed harder now, sharper. Margaret shifted slightly behind him, not intervening, but aware. Kristin's expression didn't change. "Observation has its place," she said. Jackson let out a short laugh. "Not when it becomes avoidance." Silence. The kind that didn't soften anything. The kind that made every word more visible. Kristin's hand remained steady at her side. The folder still held loosely, unopened, unused. Jackson's gaze flicked to it, then back to her face. "Carrying that around doesn't make you part of this," he said. "It just makes it look like you're pretending to be." The words were no longer controlled. They were pointed, personal. And once spoken, they could not be taken back. Kristin didn't move, didn't respond immediately, because she didn't need to. The room had already shifted, not fully, but enough. And Jackson felt it, that absence again, that lack of reinforcement, of agreement. It pushed him further, faster, past the point where he could recalibrate. "You've been given every opportunity," he said, his voice rising slightly now. "And you've done nothing with it." Kristin's gaze remained steady. "I've done what was necessary," she said. The answer was simple, but it didn't satisfy him. "Necessary," Jackson repeated. "Standing on the sidelines is necessary." Another pause, shorter now, more volatile. Kristin opened her mouth to respond, but she didn't get the chance, because Jackson stepped forward, close enough now that the distance between them disappeared. And in that moment, control slipped. Not entirely, but enough. He didn't raise his hand, didn't shout, didn't make a scene in the way people expected conflict to look. Instead, he did something quieter, something more deliberate, and far more irreversible. He spat. The motion was quick, almost casual. But the sound, the impact was unmistakable. It landed across Kristin's cheek. Warm, sharp, final. The room froze. Not metaphorically, physically. Movement stopped, breath held. No one spoke, no one stepped forward, no one intervened. Because what had just happened did not fit within the rules that governed everything around them. It was too direct, too exposed, too real. Kristin Foster did not move. Not immediately. Her eyes remained on Jackson's. Not widened, not shocked, just present. For a moment, time stretched. Not long, but enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly what they had witnessed. And exactly what it meant. Jackson stood there, breathing slightly heavier now, his expression unreadable, as if he hadn't fully registered what he had done, or perhaps as if he believed it had been justified. No one spoke. Not Margaret, not Alan, not Robert Whitman. Silence held, unbroken. Then Kristin reached into her bag, slowly, deliberately. She took out a folded piece of tissue, unhurried, unshaken, and with the same calm precision she had carried all evening. She wiped her face. No anger, no reaction, no words, just a single controlled movement. And when she lowered her hand, she looked at him again, exactly the same way she had before. Which in that moment was the most unsettling thing of all. For several seconds after the act, the room did not recover its sense of sequence, as though the carefully maintained order that had governed every interaction until that point had been quietly removed, leaving behind a space where no one quite knew how to step forward without acknowledging what had just occurred. Jackson Reed remained where he was, his posture still upright, but the confidence that had previously structured his presence now carried an unfamiliar rigidity, the kind that appears when certainty has gone too far to be easily recalled. Behind him, Margaret Reed did not immediately move to correct or contain the situation. And that absence of intervention revealed more than any reaction might have, because it signaled that even she had not anticipated a moment that could not be softened or reframed. Across from him, Kristin Foster stood with the same composed stillness she had maintained throughout the evening, her expression unchanged, her posture neither defensive nor confrontational, as though the event had not altered her position, but had instead clarified it. When she lowered the tissue from her face, there was no visible trace of urgency or humiliation, only a quiet precision in the way she folded it once, before placing it back into her bag, an action so controlled that it seemed to absorb the violence of the gesture it followed. The silence that settled over the room was not empty, but saturated with recognition. And within that recognition, something began to shift, not outwardly, not in the way that would draw attention, but internally, within the assumptions each person present had been carrying about who held authority and how that authority would be exercised. A few guests looked away, not because they wished to ignore what had happened, but because they understood that looking directly at it required a response they were not prepared to give. At the far edge of the gathering, Daniel Brooks stood partially within the doorway, having arrived moments before the incident unfolded. And though he had not interrupted or announced himself, his presence had already registered with those who recognized him. He did not step forward immediately, nor did he draw attention to the fact that he had witnessed everything. Because the value of what had occurred lay not in reaction, but in documentation. And documentation required nothing more than clarity. Kristin turned slightly, not toward Jackson, but away from the center of the room, and began to walk with a calm, measured pace toward the hallway that led to the private study, her movement neither hurried nor hesitant, as though she had simply reached the end of one part of the evening and was now proceeding to the next. No one attempted to stop her, and no one asked her to remain, because the weight of what had just happened had already removed any expectation that she would continue to participate under the same terms. Once inside the study, she closed the door quietly behind her, not to isolate herself from the gathering, but to create a space where action could be taken without interruption. The room was dimly lit, the desk still bearing traces of Jackson's earlier presence, yet everything within it now felt temporarily unclaimed, as though the authority that had once seemed anchored there had dissolved into uncertainty. She placed her folder on the desk and opened it not to review its contents again, but to align the physical record with the sequence she was about to initiate. Her phone rested beside it, and when she unlocked the screen, the earlier messages from Daniel Brooks remained visible, their language precise, their implications already understood. She began to type. The first email was addressed to Daniel Brooks, its subject line concise, its body even more so. Proceed with activation of all protective measures. Effective immediately. She did not elaborate, because elaboration would have introduced interpretation, and interpretation was unnecessary at this stage. The second email was directed to the bank's senior compliance officer, whose contact had been provided by Daniel in anticipation of this moment. The message contained references to account structures, authorization codes, and the specific clauses that permitted immediate restriction of access under conditions of irregular activity. Initiate account review and temporary suspension of non-essential transaction privileges. Authorization attached. The third message went to the internal audit team, with copies to Robert Whitman and select members of the board who had clearance to receive such communication. Trigger full audit protocol under pre-authorized flag conditions. Documentation to follow. Each message was sent without pause, not because she was acting impulsively, but because the sequence had already been determined, and the only variable remaining had been timing. Her phone vibrated almost immediately after the final message was delivered. Daniel Brooks confirmed. All measures in motion. A second vibration followed within seconds. Bank acknowledgement received. Restrictions being applied. Kristin read both messages, then placed the phone back on the desk, her hand resting lightly beside it, as though the act of sending had completed something that no longer required active attention. Outside the study, the gathering had not resumed its earlier rhythm. Voices had returned, but they carried a different quality, quieter, more fragmented, as though each conversation was being conducted with an awareness that something had shifted beyond the reach of explanation. Jackson Reed remained at the center, but the space around him had subtly widened, not physically but perceptually, as those who had once leaned in now maintained a careful distance. Alan Pierce checked his phone, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he read something that had not been there moments before, and though he quickly composed himself, the slight delay before he rejoined the conversation did not go unnoticed by those who were paying attention. Kristin closed the folder and left it on the desk, understanding that its physical presence was no longer necessary for what came next, because the evidence it contained had already been integrated into a system that did not depend on visibility. When she opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, her expression remained unchanged, her posture steady, as though the sequence of actions she had just completed existed entirely within her control and required no acknowledgement from the outside world. She did not return immediately to the center of the gathering. Instead, she paused at the edge, allowing herself a moment to observe the subtle recalibrations that had begun to take place. The way conversations now hesitated before forming, the way certain individuals avoided direct eye contact with Jackson, and the way Margaret Reed's composure had shifted from assured to vigilant, as though she were attempting to identify a disturbance she could not yet define. Kristin's phone vibrated once more. Daniel Brooks' emergency board meeting scheduled. 9:00 a.m. Attendance confirmed. She read the message and locked the screen, her gaze lifting once more to the room that had only minutes earlier believed itself to be stable, to be structured, to be governed by rules that could not be easily disrupted. Now, without any announcement, without any visible declaration, that structure had begun to respond to something it did not yet understand. And Kristin, standing quietly at its edge, had already moved beyond the point where explanation would matter. Morning did not arrive with the drama. There were no messages waiting on the front page of the news, no sudden calls from journalists, no visible sign that anything beyond a private incident had taken place the night before. The Reed estate looked exactly as it always had in the early hours, quiet, orderly, untouched by whatever had unfolded within its walls. But beneath that stillness, its systems had already begun to respond. Jackson Reed woke later than usual, not because he had intended to, but because sleep had come in fragments rather than rest. The memory of the previous evening did not arrive all at once. Instead, it surfaced in pieces disjointed and incomplete, as though his mind had chosen to separate the event from the sequence that led to it. He sat up, pressing his hand briefly against his forehead, and for a moment allowed himself to believe that what he remembered might have been exaggerated, that whatever had occurred could be reframed, explained, absorbed into the normal patterns of conflict that resolved themselves with time. That assumption lasted until he reached for his phone. The first sign was subtle. A notification from the company's internal system, time-stamped several hours earlier than he had expected any communication to occur. Access update. Your permissions have been modified. Please contact administration for further details. He frowned, tapping the notification, expecting it to resolve into something temporary, something technical. It did not. The interface loaded, but sections he had accessed freely the day before were now restricted. Financial dashboards displayed limited data. Certain files returned error messages that were not phrased as system faults, but as controlled denials. He tried another application, then another. The pattern remained. Not a failure, a removal. His jaw tightened. He stood, moving quickly now, crossing the room toward the study where his laptop remained on the desk. When he opened it, the same limitations appeared, this time more clearly defined. Authorization required, request denied, contact compliance. The language was precise, deliberate, not automated in the way routine system updates tended to be. Jackson's first instinct was irritation, not concern. Systems failed. Permissions changed. These things happened especially during periods of internal adjustment. But something about the timing, about the uniformity of the restrictions, suggested otherwise. He opened his email. There were messages waiting. Several. One from Alan Pierce. "We need to speak, immediately." Another sent minutes later, "Call me as soon as you see this." Jackson dialed before fully reading the rest. The line connected quickly. "Alan," he said, his tone controlled but edged. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but enough. "Have you tried accessing the accounts?" Alan asked. "I just did. They're restricted." "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Alan replied. And for the first time since Jackson had known him, there was something unfamiliar in his voice. Uncertainty. "That's not a system error," Alan continued. "That's a compliance-level intervention." Jackson's grip on the phone tightened. "On whose authority?" Another pause. "I don't know yet," Alan said. "But it's not coming from within our usual chain. Our." The word registered. Jackson moved toward the window, his mind beginning to reassemble the fragments of the previous evening. The gathering, the confrontation, Kristin. The moment he stopped the thought before it fully formed. "This is temporary," he said more to himself than to Alan. "Someone's overstepping. It'll be reversed." "It's already been acknowledged by the bank," Alan replied. "That stopped him," "Acknowledged," Jackson repeated. "Yes," Alan said, "and not as a request, as an authorized action." Silence followed. Not empty, loaded. Jackson's thoughts moved faster now, attempting to locate the source, to identify the mechanism through which something like this could be executed without his knowledge. "There must be a mistake," he said finally. "We didn't trigger anything that would—" "We," Alan interrupted quietly. Jackson didn't respond immediately, because in that moment the words sounded different, less certain, less shared. Alan exhaled softly. "There's more," he said. Jackson waited. "The board has been called," Alan continued. "Emergency meeting, 9 o'clock. Jackson glanced at the time. Less than an hour. "By who?" he asked. "I haven't been told directly," Alan said. "But the notice came through official channels. It's legitimate." Jackson's mind moved quickly through possibilities. The board could not act unilaterally without cause, and cause required authority. He ended the call without another word. The house felt different now, not visibly, but in the way sound carried, in the way silence settled. He stepped into the hallway, moving with a controlled urgency that stopped just short of revealing concern. At the far end, Margaret Reed stood near the staircase, speaking with one of the staff members. When she saw him, she dismissed the conversation and turned her full attention toward him. "There's been a disruption," he said without preamble. "System access, financial controls. It's being handled." Margaret studied him. "Handled by whom?" she asked. Jackson hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. "We're finding out," he said. Margaret's expression tightened, though she maintained her composure. "This is not the time for uncertainty," she said, "especially not after last night." The reference hung between them, unspoken, unexpanded. Jackson's gaze shifted briefly. "Last night doesn't change anything," he said. Margaret held his gaze. It was not agreement. It was assessment. "Make sure of that," she replied. He nodded once and turned away, already reaching for his phone again, already moving toward the next call. The next attempt to reestablish control over something that no longer responded to him in the way it had only hours before. Elsewhere in the house, Kristin Foster stood near the same window she had occupied the evening before. The morning light softened the edges of the room, revealing nothing of what had changed and everything of what had. Her phone rested in her hand. No urgency, no tension, just information. She had received the same notifications, seen the same confirmations. But where Jackson searched for explanation, she required none. Because the sequence had already been set. Because the actions now unfolding were not reactions, but continuations. She read the latest message from Daniel Brooks, all measures active. Board convening as scheduled. Documentation prepared. Kristin locked the screen, lifted her gaze. Across the room, the structure of the house remained unchanged. The furniture, the light, the carefully preserved image of stability. But beneath it, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. And within that shift, roles that had once seemed fixed were beginning to realign. Jackson moved through the house as if searching for a point of reference that would restore what had been interrupted. Kristin did not move at all, because she no longer needed to. The system was already responding. And by the time the board convened, what had begun as a private act would no longer remain contained within the walls of a single room. It would exist where it could not be dismissed, where it could not be reframed, where it could only be recognized. The boardroom did not rely on decoration to establish authority. Its power came from restraint. A long table of dark wood stretched across the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs that had held decades of decisions no one outside the room had ever fully understood. Floor-to-ceiling windows allowed the morning light to enter without warmth, illuminating the space, with a clarity that revealed everything and softened nothing. Robert Whitman stood near the head of the table, reviewing a set of documents laid out with precise alignment. He did not look toward the door when it opened, though he was aware of each arrival registering them, not by sight, but by the subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere. Jackson Reed entered first. He did not rush, but there was a contained urgency in the way he moved, as if he were holding himself just inside the boundary of composure. His expression remained controlled, but the absence of access from earlier that morning had not left him unchanged. It had introduced a question he had not yet been able to answer. "Robert," he said, approaching the table, "I assume there's been some kind of miscommunication." Whitman did not respond immediately. He finished aligning the document in front of him, then looked up. "We'll begin when everyone is present," he said. The tone was neutral, final. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Moments later, Alan Pierce entered, his usual composure intact, but thinner now, as though it required more effort to maintain. He took a seat without speaking his attention, shifting briefly toward Jackson before returning to the documents in front of him. Others followed. Board members, advisors, each taking their place with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to operating within structures that did not allow for uncertainty. Finally, the door opened again. Kristin Foster stepped inside. She did not hesitate at the threshold. She did not look around to assess the room. She simply walked forward, her posture steady, her expression composed, as though she had entered this space not as a guest, but as someone who had always belonged to it. Conversations, minimal as they were, ceased entirely. Whitman inclined his head slightly. "Miss Foster," he said. The acknowledgement was brief, but precise. Kristin returned the nod and took her seat. Not at the far end, not beside Jackson, but at a position that, while not central, aligned directly with the head of the table in a way that suggested balance rather than hierarchy. Whitman remained standing. "We'll proceed," he said. He placed both hands lightly on the table, his gaze moving across the room, ensuring that attention had settled completely. This meeting has been called under provisions outlined in the Foster Group's governing structure, he began, specifically those relating to changes in controlling interest and the activation of associated oversight protocols. Jackson leaned forward slightly. "Robert," he said, unable to hold back before we go further, "I'd like clarification on the restrictions that were placed on my access this morning." Whitman looked at him, not dismissively, but without urgency. "That will be addressed," he said. "In sequence." The word carried weight. Sequence, order, process. Jackson exhaled, leaning back, though the movement was more controlled than relaxed. Whitman continued. "As of 8:00 a.m. today, confirmation was received from all relevant financial and legal institutions that the transfer of controlling interest has been completed in accordance with the terms established by the late Edward Foster." A subtle shift moved through the room, not visible, but felt. Jackson's gaze flicked almost involuntarily toward Kristin. Whitman did not pause. Effective immediately, he said, "All voting authority and executive oversight rights associated with that interest are held by a single party." Silence followed, not uncertain, anticipatory. Whitman turned slightly, not toward Jackson, toward Kristin. "Miss Foster," he said, "would you like to confirm?" Kristin did not move immediately. She allowed the moment to settle. Then she spoke. "Yes," she said, "I confirm." Her voice was calm, unembellished, but absolute. Jackson stared at her, not in disbelief, not entirely, but in the beginning of it. "That's not possible," he said. No one responded, not because they agreed, because the statement did not alter the reality that had just been established. Whitman reached for a document and slid it forward. "Documentation has been distributed," he said. "The trust structure transfer conditions and confirmations from all institutions involved are included." Alan picked up the document first. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then slower. Then he stopped. Not dramatically, just stopped. Jackson did not reach for his copy. He continued to look at Kristin. "You knew about this," he said. It was not a question. Kristin met his gaze. "I understood the structure," she said. The distinction mattered. Jackson's expression hardened. "And you didn't think to mention it?" he asked. Kristin's posture did not change. "There was no requirement to do so," she replied. The room remained still, because the answer was not defensive. It was procedural. Jackson leaned forward again, this time more sharply. "You let this happen without saying anything," he said. Kristin considered the phrasing, then responded. "It was already happening," she said. "I chose not to interrupt the process." Alan exhaled quietly, setting the document down with more care than necessary. Whitman continued as though the exchange had not occurred. "In addition to the transfer of authority," he said, "certain protective measures have been activated in response to irregular financial activity identified within the company's internal systems." That drew attention, immediate, focused. Jackson turned back toward him. "What irregular activity?" he demanded. Whitman did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Transactions have been flagged," he said. "Patterns consistent with unauthorized routing of funds through intermediary accounts." Alan's hands remained still on the table. Jackson's did not. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It is a documented observation," Whitman corrected. The difference again was deliberate. Whitman gestured toward another set of documents. "Supporting records are included," he said, "compiled through pre-authorized audit protocols." Alan picked up the second set. This time, he did not move quickly. He read, carefully. Jackson reached for his copy at last. The pages moved under his hands. Dates, amounts, entities. Each line on its own appeared manageable, explainable. But together they formed something else, something structured, something that did not rely on interpretation. Jackson's breathing changed, slightly. Enough. This doesn't prove anything, he said, though the certainty in his voice had shifted. Whitman inclined his head. It establishes a pattern, he said, which is sufficient for interim action. Alan spoke then. For the first time. This wasn't supposed to trigger, he said quietly. The room turned toward him. Jackson looked at him sharply. What do you mean, he asked. Alan did not answer immediately, because the answer once spoken would confirm more than he was prepared to say. Whitman intervened. Mr. Pierce, he said, you will have an opportunity to respond formally. Alan nodded. Once. Slowly. Whitman continued. Effective immediately, all individuals identified within the flagged activity will have their access restricted, pending full review, he said. Jackson's gaze snapped back to him. You can't just... We can, Whitman said. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with finality. Because the authority behind the statement no longer required consensus. Jackson looked back at Kristin, and for the first time, there was no challenge in his expression. Only the realization that the structure he had been moving within had never been his to control. Kristin did not look away. She did not speak. She did not need to. Because everything that mattered had already been said. And everything that followed would no longer depend on him. The room did not fracture into chaos after the disclosures. Instead, it settled into a deeper kind of order, one that no longer depended on assumption or personality, but on process documentation, and the quiet authority of structure asserting itself where it had previously remained unseen. Robert Whitman did not raise his voice, nor did he need to call for attention, because every person present understood that the sequence unfolding now, was no longer subject to interruption. What had been introduced was not an allegation, but a framework. And frameworks, once activated, moved forward whether individuals agreed with them or not. Let us proceed with clarity. Whitman said, his tone measured, his hands resting lightly on the table as though anchoring the room to the process rather than the tension within it. The objective here is not to assign intent prematurely, but to establish what can be verified through records that have already been secured. Across from him, Jackson Reed sat with a stillness that did not suggest calm, but containment. The documents in front of him remained open, his eyes having moved across them multiple times already, as though repetition might alter what they showed. The columns of numbers, the timestamps, the routing structures, none of them were individually incriminating in a way that could not be argued. Yet, together, they formed a continuity that resisted simplification. It's circumstantial, Jackson said, though the confidence that had once defined his tone now carried an edge of insistence rather than certainty. You're connecting unrelated transactions and presenting them as a pattern. Whitman inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. The records were compiled through pre-authorized audit triggers, he replied. Those triggers are based on deviation from established financial behavior. They do not interpret. They record. The distinction was deliberate, and it did not leave room for rhetorical defense. At the adjacent seat, Alan Pierce remained focused on the documents. His posture unchanged, but his attention more precise, as though he were calculating not how to deny what had been presented, but how much of it could be explained without exposing the rest. These routing structures are standard in certain forms of asset management. Alan said after a moment, his voice controlled the language carefully selected. Intermediary accounts are used to manage liquidity, particularly in transitional periods. Whitman did not challenge him directly. Standard structures, he said, do not typically repeat across unrelated accounts with synchronized timing. Alan's gaze lifted briefly, then returned to the page. That depends on the strategy being implemented, he replied. And on who authorized that strategy, Whitman added. Silence followed, not because the question lacked an answer. But because the answer once given would define the scope of responsibility in a way that could not be retracted, at the far end of the table, Kristin Foster sat without movement, her hands resting lightly in front of her. Her attention fixed not on any single speaker, but on the continuity of the discussion itself. She did not intervene. She did not direct. Her role at this stage was not to argue, but to allow the structure her father had designed to reveal itself without obstruction. Whitman reached for another document. "This is a transcript excerpt from a recorded internal discussion," he said, placing it at the center of the table where it could be viewed by all. "It does not serve as primary evidence, but it provides contextual alignment with the activity observed in the financial records." Jackson's gaze shifted to the document, his expression tightening as he recognized the format. Audio, transcribed. Fragments of conversation preserved in language that removed tone but retained meaning. Whitman did not read it aloud. He allowed the room to absorb it individually. Jackson's eyes moved across the lines. A pause, then further down. The phrasing was familiar, too familiar. He did not need to see the attribution to recognize his own words. "We'll handle it after the transition. No reason to complicate things now. She won't be involved." The sequence was incomplete, but sufficient. Jackson closed the document, not abruptly, but with a finality that suggested he understood the implications, even if he was not prepared to acknowledge them. "That's taken out of context," he said. Whitman did not respond immediately, because context in this case was not defined by explanation. It was defined by alignment. "Context is established through consistency across independent sources," he said after a moment. "Financial records, communication patterns, and timing structures." Allen exhaled softly, the sound barely audible but enough to draw brief attention before it disappeared again into the larger silence. "This is escalating beyond internal review," he said, his voice quieter now, less defensive, more procedural. "If we're moving toward formal action, then representation needs to be established." Whitman nodded once. "That is correct," he said. "This meeting constitutes the preliminary phase of that process." Jackson leaned back slightly, his posture shifting from confrontation to calculation. "You're suspending access based on this," he said. "Without a full investigation, access has been restricted," Whitman corrected. "Pending investigation. That distinction is important." "And my role?" Jackson asked. Whitman's gaze did not waver. "Temporarily suspended," he said, "effective immediately." The words settled into the room with a weight that did not require emphasis. Jackson did not respond, not immediately, because the structure he had relied on, the assumption that his position was secured through proximity, through expectation, through the gradual normalization of his presence, had just been formally removed. Across from him, Kristin remained still. Not because she lacked response, because response was no longer necessary. The system had moved beyond the point where personal exchange held influence. Margaret Reed was not present in the room, but her absence carried its own significance. She had built her understanding of control on visibility, on presence, on the ability to shape perception through proximity. This process unfolding now did not rely on any of those elements. It relied on documentation, on sequence, on authority that had been assigned long before anyone thought to challenge it. Whitman closed the final folder. "The next phase will involve a formal audit review conducted by an independent entity," he said. "All relevant materials will be transferred accordingly. Until that time, no further transactions will be authorized outside standard operational requirements." Allen nodded. Once. Slowly. Jackson did not. His gaze had shifted again, back to Kristin. But this time, there was no expectation in it. No demand. No attempt to draw her into response. Only the recognition that she had never been outside the structure he had been trying to navigate. She had been at its center, from the beginning. And everything that had unfolded since the previous evening, from the silence in the room to the messages sent to the restrictions now in place, had not been reaction, but execution. Kristin met his gaze briefly. Not to confront, not to confirm. Simply to acknowledge that the moment he had believed he controlled had already passed, and that what remained would no longer depend on what he chose to say. The corridor outside the boardroom carried a different kind of silence than the one inside. It was not structured by procedure or governed by formal language, but shaped instead by what had just concluded, an awareness that something irreversible had taken place, even if its full consequences had not yet unfolded. Jackson Reed stepped out first. He did not look back, not because he did not want to, but because looking back would have required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in that moment felt indistinguishable from concession. His pace was measured, controlled, though not entirely steady. The door closed behind him with a soft final sound that seemed to separate what had just happened from whatever came next. For several seconds he stood still, his hand resting briefly against the wall, as though grounding himself in something that had not shifted. Then he exhaled and moved. Further down the corridor, near a bank of tall windows that overlooked the city, Kristin Foster stood alone. She had left the boardroom quietly, without drawing attention, without waiting for the room to empty. Her departure had not required acknowledgement, because her presence had already fulfilled its purpose. Now removed from the structure of the meeting, she returned to the same stillness she had maintained throughout. Jackson saw her. He slowed, not out of hesitation, out of recognition. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was not large, but it carried more weight than any physical space could measure. Finally, Jackson stepped forward. Kristin. Her name sounded different now, not because of how it was spoken, but because of everything that had changed around it. She turned slightly to face him. Yes. The simplicity of her response left no room for interpretation. Jackson studied her as though searching for some trace of the person he believed he had known. The version of her that had remained quiet, unassertive, peripheral to the decisions he had assumed would define their future. "I need to understand what just happened," he said. It was not an accusation, not yet. But it was no longer neutral. Kristin held his gaze. "You were present in the room," she said. The process was explained. "That wasn't an explanation," he replied, his voice tightening. "That was a presentation of conclusions." A brief pause followed. Kristin considered his words, not dismissing them, but not accepting their premise either. The conclusions were based on documented activity, she said. They were not introduced without basis. Jackson shook his head slightly. "You're deflecting," he said. "I'm asking you directly. How long have you known?" The question lingered, not because it was difficult to answer, because it revealed what he was truly asking. Not about the structure, not about the company, about her. Kristin did not answer immediately. She looked past him out toward the city for a moment, as though aligning her thoughts with something beyond the conversation itself. "Long enough," she said finally. Jackson exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters," she replied. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. Jackson stepped closer, the distance narrowing now, though the space between them remained unchanged in every way that counted. "You let this happen," he said. "You let me walk into that room without saying anything." Kristin's expression remained steady. "It was not my role to intervene before the process reached its point of activation," she said. Jackson stared at her. "That's what this is to you?" he asked. "A process." The word carried weight now, more than before. Kristin did not move. "It is a structure," she said, "and it functions independently of personal interaction." Jackson let out a short, incredulous breath. "You're talking about our lives," he said. "Our marriage." not just some corporate structure. The distinction to him was obvious. To her, it was already resolved. "Our marriage and the company have been intersecting for some time," she said. "You chose to engage with that intersection in a specific way." The words were precise, not accusatory, but not dismissive either. Jackson's gaze hardened. "You think I did something wrong?" he said. Kristin did not respond immediately, because the question as phrased suggested something subjective, something open to interpretation. What had been presented in the boardroom was not. "This is not about what I think," she said. "Then what is it about?" he pressed. Kristin looked at him fully now. "Records," she said. "Actions, sequence." Each word was measured, intentional. Jackson shook his head again, this time more forcefully. "Those records don't tell the whole story," he said. "You know that." "They don't need to," she replied. The simplicity of the answer landed harder than any argument. Jackson's expression shifted frustration, giving way to something more focused, more urgent. "This can still be resolved," he said. "If you step in. If you clarify things with the board, explain." He stopped. Not because he had finished, because he realized what he was asking. Kristin did not interrupt. She allowed the realization to form fully. "You're asking me to alter a documented process," she said. "I'm asking you to correct a situation that's being misinterpreted," he replied. Kristin held his gaze. "There is no misinterpretation," she said. The certainty in her voice was not forceful. It was final. Jackson's shoulders tensed. "You're choosing this," he said. Another pause, this one longer. Kristin did not answer immediately because the statement, like the question before it, was framed in a way that did not align with the structure she was operating within. "Choices were made before today," she said. "What you're seeing now is the result of those choices." Jackson looked at her, as though trying to find a point where the conversation could still shift, where something could be undone, redirected, softened. He did not find it. "And last night," he asked, his voice lower now. "Does that factor into any of this?" The question lingered differently than the others. Not procedural, personal. For the first time, Kristin's gaze shifted. Not away, but inward, as though acknowledging the moment without allowing it to define the outcome. "Last night confirmed something," she said. Jackson waited. What he asked. Kristin met his eyes again. "That the timing was appropriate," she said. The answer was not what he expected. Not an accusation, not an emotional response. Something else entirely. Jackson stepped back slightly, as though the distance he had closed moments earlier now needed to be reestablished. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The corridor remained quiet, unchanged. And yet everything within it had already moved beyond the point where either of them could return to what had been. Jackson looked at her one last time, not with certainty, not with control, but with the understanding that whatever position he believed he had held within the company, within their marriage, within the structure he thought he understood had never been as secure as he had assumed. Kristin did not move, because she did not need to. The structure had already moved for her. News inside the company did not spread in the way it often did outside of it, where speculation and exaggeration shaped the narrative before facts could stabilize it. Within the Foster Group, information moved through channels that had been designed long before anyone in the current structure had taken their positions, and those channels prioritized clarity over speed sequence, over reaction. By midday, an internal memorandum had been circulated. It did not reference the gathering from the previous evening. It did not mention personal conflict. It outlined in precise language that an interim audit review had been initiated under pre-authorized governance protocols, that certain access privileges had been restricted pending verification, and that operational continuity would be maintained under the supervision of designated leadership. At the bottom of the memorandum, the name Kristin Foster appeared. Not prominently, not emphasized, simply placed where authority required identification. For many within the company, the name was not unfamiliar, but its position within that document altered its meaning entirely. In the accounting division, a senior analyst paused over the memo, reading it twice, before forwarding it to a colleague with a brief message. This aligns with what we flagged last quarter. In legal associates, who had previously worked under Daniel Brooks, recognized the phrasing immediately, understanding that the language used did not allow for ambiguity, nor did it suggest a temporary adjustment. It reflected activation, not consideration. In operations, managers who had once received directives indirectly now found themselves referencing a structure that had become more explicit overnight. The shift was not chaotic. It was quiet. But it was absolute. At the Reed estate, the response followed a different pattern. Margaret Reed had received the memorandum not through internal distribution, but through a forwarded copy from a contact who had assumed she would already be aware of its contents. She read it once. Then again. Her expression did not change immediately, but something in her posture tightened, as though the information had introduced a variable she had not accounted for. "This is a procedural overreach," she said, placing the document on the table in front of her. Across from her, Jackson Reed remained seated, his attention fixed not on the paper, but on the implications it carried. "It's not an overreach," he said after a moment. "It's structured." The word did not come easily. Margaret looked at him. "What does that mean?" she asked. Jackson exhaled slowly. "It means this was already in place," he said, "before any of this happened." Margaret's gaze sharpened. By whom? Jackson did not answer immediately. Because the answer, while clear, did not resolve anything. Instead, it complicated everything. Meanwhile, across town, Kristin moved through the Foster Group headquarters. With the same measured pace she had carried into every room she had entered over the years, though the reception she encountered now had shifted in ways that did not require acknowledgement to be understood. Staff members who had previously greeted her with polite neutrality now did so with a subtle recalibration, their tone more attentive, their posture more aligned, not out of deference, but out of recognition. Not of her as a person, of her position within the structure they operated in. She did not pause to engage beyond what was necessary. She did not acknowledge the shift directly, because doing so would have introduced a layer of interpretation that the system itself did not require. In a conference room on the executive floor, Robert Whitman and several senior members of the board were already in discussion when she entered. The conversation paused, not abruptly, but completely. Whitman inclined his head. "Miss Foster," he said. Kristin took her seat. The documents in front of her were already arranged. Audit summaries, preliminary findings, timelines. She reviewed them without comment, her attention moving across the pages with the same precision she had applied to every piece of information she had collected over the past months. "There has been internal response," Whitman said after a moment. "Some departments have begun to adjust their reporting structures in anticipation of further directives." Kristin nodded slightly. "That is appropriate," she said. Whitman studied her for a moment. Not evaluating, confirming. "The external audit firm has accepted the engagement," he continued. "They will begin their review within 48 hours. Kristin closed the folder in front of her. "Ensure they have full access to all flagged accounts," she said. "No limitations beyond standard confidentiality protocols." Whitman nodded. "That has already been arranged." There was a pause. Not uncertain, deliberate. "The Reed family has not issued a response," Whitman added. Kristin's expression did not change. "They are not required to," she said. The statement was not dismissive. It was factual. Whitman inclined his head again. Understood. The meeting continued, not with dramatic shifts, but with incremental adjustments, assignments, confirmations. processes moving forward with the same quiet efficiency that had defined the company long before any individual had attempted to reshape it. Later that evening, Kristin returned to the house she had shared with Jackson. The space felt unchanged in its physical structure, yet entirely altered in its meaning. Objects remained where they had been. Furniture, lighting, the arrangement of a life that had once appeared stable. But stability, she understood, was not defined by appearance. It was defined by alignment. And alignment, once disrupted, could not be restored through familiarity alone. She moved through the rooms without hesitation, not lingering, not searching for anything that required reconsideration. In the bedroom, a suitcase rested at the foot of the bed, unpacked, not as a sign of departure, as preparation. Kristin set her bag down and began to gather what she needed, not with urgency, but with clarity. Documents, personal items, nothing that required negotiation, nothing that depended on shared ownership. Outside the room, footsteps approached, then paused. A knock followed. Not loud, but deliberate. Kristin did not respond immediately. She closed the suitcase, then turned toward the door. "Come in," she said. The handle turned. And as the door opened, what remained of the life that had once existed in that house stood on the threshold, no longer certain of its place within it. The door did not open with hesitation. Jackson Reed stepped into the room with a composure that looked intact from a distance, but upon closer observation revealed something more fragile beneath it, as though the structure that had once supported his certainty had been quietly dismantled, leaving him to reconstruct his position without the framework he had relied on. Kristin Foster did not turn immediately when he entered. She finished placing a document into her suitcase, closed it with deliberate care, and only then shifted her attention toward him. Her posture unchanged, her expression calm, in a way that did not invite conversation, but did not refuse it either. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The room, once shared without question, now held a different kind of presence, one shaped not by familiarity, but by the recognition that whatever had existed between them no longer operated under the same assumptions. Jackson took a step forward. "I didn't expect you to start packing this soon," he said. His tone was controlled, but it lacked the quiet authority he had once carried so easily. Kristin regarded him steadily. "This is not sudden," she replied. "It is aligned with what has already taken place." Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. "You're leaving," he said, as though stating it in plain terms might somehow alter its weight. Kristin did not deny it. "I'm transitioning out of this space," she said. The phrasing was precise, deliberate. Jackson let out a short breath, the sound carrying more frustration than he intended to reveal. "You're talking about it like it's a business decision," he said. Kristin did not respond immediately because the distinction he was attempting to draw had already been resolved in her mind. "It is a decision," she said, "and it follows from a series of actions that made continuation under the same conditions no longer viable." Jackson moved further into the room, now his presence no longer held at the threshold, though the distance between them remained defined by something that could not be crossed through proximity alone. "You're ending this," he said. Kristin met his gaze. "I am formalizing what has already changed," she replied. The words settled into the space between them with a quiet finality. Jackson's expression shifted not into anger, but into something more focused, more urgent, as though he were searching for a point at which the conversation could still be redirected. "This doesn't have to go that far," he said. "We can address what happened. We can correct it." Kristin's gaze did not waver. "Correction implies deviation from an intended path," she said. What occurred was not a deviation. It was a confirmation. Jackson shook his head slightly, the movement sharper than before. "You're reducing everything to structure," he said, "to processes and sequences. This is more than that." Kristin considered his words, not dismissing them, but not allowing them to redefine the situation either. "It is both," she said. but the structure determines what is sustainable. Jackson's frustration became more visible now, though it remained contained within the boundaries he was still attempting to maintain. "And what about us?" he asked. "Does that structure account for that?" Kristin's expression softened but only slightly, and not in a way that suggested uncertainty. "It accounts for what was documented," she said. "What was observed, what was repeated." The phrasing was consistent with everything she had said before, and that consistency, more than any single statement, made it impossible to reinterpret her position. Jackson exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly away, before returning to her. "You're not even angry," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. Kristin paused. Not because the question was difficult, but because the answer required clarity. "Anger would not change the outcome," she said. "That's not what I asked," he replied. Kristin held his gaze. "No," she said, "it's not." Silence followed, not empty, but filled with the recognition that they were no longer speaking from the same framework. Jackson stepped back slightly, as though the proximity he had closed earlier now needed to be re-established in order to think more clearly. "This is about last night," he said. "You're using that as justification." Kristin did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist as it was without correcting its phrasing, because correction would have implied that it contained an error that could be adjusted. Instead, she spoke with the same measured precision she had maintained throughout. "Last night was not a justification," she said. "It was a point of confirmation." Jackson's expression tightened. Confirmation of what Kristin answered without hesitation. "That the pattern had reached its conclusion," she said. The words did not carry accusation. They carried resolution. Jackson looked at her, as though trying to locate the moment where that conclusion had formed, where the outcome he was now facing had become inevitable. He did not find it, because it had not been a single moment. It had been a sequence, a series of actions, each one aligning with the next, each one moving towards something that had already been prepared long before he recognized it. "This didn't start last night," he said quietly. Kristin inclined her head slightly. "No," she said. "It didn't." Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that does not seek to be filled. Jackson's gaze moved across the room, taking in the details he had once considered permanent. The arrangement of furniture, the placement of objects, the structure of a shared space that now felt unmistakably temporary. "When did you decide?" he asked. Kristin's answer came without delay. "I didn't decide in a single moment," she said. "I documented over time." The decision was the result of that documentation. Jackson let out a breath that carried something heavier now, something closer to understanding than resistance. "So there was nothing I could have said," he said. Kristin did not soften the answer. "No," she said. The honesty of it removed any remaining ambiguity. Jackson nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. For a moment he stood there, as though considering whether there was anything left to say, anything that had not already been resolved by the structure she had described. There wasn't, because what remained was not a conversation. It was an outcome. Kristin moved then not toward him, but toward the suitcase, lifting it from the foot of the bed with the same quiet control she had applied to every action since the previous evening. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She simply acted. Jackson watched her, not attempting to stop her, not attempting to intervene, because something in his posture had already shifted from assertion to recognition. "You're not going to look back," he said. It was not a question. Kristin paused at the doorway. Not long, just enough. "Looking back would not change what has already been established," she said. Then she stepped out. The door remained open behind her, but the space she left no longer belonged to both of them. And as Jackson stood alone in the room that had once held certainty, the absence she left behind was not defined by loss alone, but by the realization that what he had believed to be his position had never been secured in the way he had imagined. It had only appeared that way, until it didn't. The final transition did not arrive with spectacle. There was no public statement designed to reshape perception. No deliberate attempt to reclaim narrative through visibility or reaction. Instead, the Foster Group moved forward in the same way it had always sustained itself, through structure, continuity, and decisions that did not require explanation to remain effective. By the end of the week, the internal audit had progressed beyond preliminary review. External investigators had been granted full access to the flagged accounts, their work conducted with the same procedural discipline that had defined every stage of the process thus far. The patterns identified earlier were not dismissed, nor were they exaggerated. They were expanded, verified, and placed within a broader framework that removed any remaining ambiguity. Alan Pierce had formally retained representation. Jackson Reed had done the same. Their roles within the company remained suspended, not as punishment, but as a necessary condition of review. A distinction that mattered within the governance structure, even if it did little to alter the personal consequences already in motion. At headquarters, operations continued without interruption. Departments adjusted reporting lines. Approvals followed newly reinforced channels. And throughout it all, the name Kristin Foster appeared only where it needed to, on documents and confirmations, within the systems that defined authority, without requiring it to be announced. She did not give interviews. She did not address the incident at the gathering. She did not attempt to correct or shape how it might be remembered outside of the structures that actually governed outcome. Instead, she focused on alignment, on restoring internal balance where it had been quietly disrupted, on ensuring that the systems her father had built were not only protected but understood by those responsible for maintaining them. In her first formal address to senior staff, the room reflected a different kind of attention than the one that had gathered around Jackson days earlier. There was no anticipation of performance, no expectation of persuasion. Only readiness. Kristin stood at the front, not elevated, not positioned above, but clearly placed within the structure she now represented. She did not begin immediately. She allowed the room to settle into silence, not as a tactic, but as a condition for clarity. Then she spoke. "The company has operated under a set of principles that were not always visible," she said. "But they were always present." Her voice carried without effort. Not because it was raised, because it was precise. "Those principles are not changing," she continued. "What is changing is the level of alignment required to maintain them." She did not reference individuals. She did not revisit events. She spoke only in terms of structure. Decisions will be made based on documented information, she said. Not assumption, not proximity, not interpretation. The language was consistent, deliberate, and it required no elaboration. "Where patterns indicate deviation, they will be addressed," she continued. "Not reactively, not personally, but through process." She paused. "Not for effect, for completeness. Integrity is not something we assert," she said. "It is something we demonstrate through consistency." The room remained still. Not because the words were unexpected, because they aligned with something deeper than statement. They aligned with the system itself. Kristin did not extend the address beyond what was necessary. She did not invite questions that would shift the focus away from what had already been established. When she concluded, she stepped back, not waiting for response, not seeking acknowledgement, because acknowledgement in that context was not required. Outside the company, the legal process continued. Quietly, deliberately, there were filings, responses, procedural steps that followed one another in sequence, each one building on documentation that had been secured long before the first question had been raised. Kristin did not attend every meeting. She did not need to. Her presence was not required for the system to function. That, more than anything, reflected the completeness of what had been put in place. In her personal life, the transition was equally measured. The house she had shared with Jackson no longer appeared in her routine. Her belongings had been moved, her space redefined. Not as an act of departure, but as an extension of alignment. There were no confrontations, no final arguments, no attempt to revisit what had already been resolved. Because what had occurred between them had not been a single moment that could be addressed in isolation. It had been a pattern, and patterns, once confirmed, did not require repetition to remain understood. One evening, standing alone in a new apartment that overlooked a quieter part of the city, Kristin paused at the window. The view was different. Not expansive, not symbolic, just steady. Her phone rested on the table behind her, silent. No urgent messages, no unresolved threads. Everything that required action had already been set in motion. Everything that required response had already been addressed. What remained was not absence. It was space, not empty, defined. She did not reflect on the gathering. Not in the way others might have. She did not revisit the moment that had, for many, defined the turning point. Because for her, that moment had not been the cause. It had been the confirmation, a visible point within a sequence that had already been moving toward its conclusion. And now that conclusion had been reached, not through confrontation, not through reaction, but through a structure that had allowed everything to unfold without deviation. Kristin turned away from the window. The room remained quiet, unchanged. And as she moved forward, there was no sense of victory in her expression, no satisfaction in the outcome. Only the quiet certainty of someone who had followed a process to its end and understood that what came next would not require explanation to remain intact. She did not look back, because there was nothing left behind that needed to be reclaimed, only what had already been resolved. The story does not end with the moment of exposure, nor with the removal of power from someone who once believed it was his to hold. It settles somewhere quieter in the space where actions have already spoken and no longer require repetition. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not respond to humiliation with noise or retaliation, but instead allows truth to emerge through consistency, through patience, and through an understanding of timing that cannot be forced. Kristin never raised her voice, never argued for recognition, and never asked to be seen differently. She simply allowed reality to become visible on its own terms. And perhaps that is where the deeper question remains, not about who was right or wrong, but about how often we mistake silence for weakness, or assume that power must always be displayed in order to exist. If you stayed with this story until the end, you already understand that the most decisive moments are not always the loudest ones. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and I value the perspectives that come from different places and experiences. And if you appreciate stories that explore quiet strength justice through process and the kind of clarity that doesn't need to be forced, you're welcome to follow along.